1949. Huge surprise success and started the phenomenon of what became known quickly as the comic book. Superman was published by National Periodical Publications, which became DC Comics, and there was a rival of Marvel, but then there was this other publisher called Fawcett Publications, and they wanted to get in on this comic book thing. So an artist and writer named C.C. Beck came up with this super being, and by this time it was 1940. So Superman started in 38, big hit, and then they debuted Captain Marvel in 1940. But there was a big, they thought there was a big difference in the two concepts of these characters. And also, by this time, Batman and Robin had been introduced by DC Comics. And the Batman and Robin concept was really sort of brilliant. Also, like I said, DC, because one of the editors thought, who is our audience? Our audience is kids. So they can pretend that they want to be Superman or Batman, but we're going to give them a character, Robin, that they can really identify with because he's their age. And so now they can be with Superman and Batman, which for them was sort of closer to reality. The editors at Fawcett Publications took that concept one step better. So what if we create this kid, Billy Batson, who's, 11, 12 years old, and give him a secret word that he can say, Shazam, and then he turns into Captain Marvel. And this was actually a pretty brilliant idea because it combined the two. So you could sort of be Robin and then say Shazam, and now you're Batman. Except it's Captain Marvel. So as she said, the story goes, young Billy Batson is sort of this orphan living on the streets, selling newspapers to get by, with a sort of mysterious history that he can't remember. He can't remember who his parents are or anything like that. And it sort of takes place in New York. And a mysterious stranger asks him to ride the subway with him, which of course today would not fly. But so they ride this subway car into this mysterious cavern, and he's taken by this stranger down this subway tunnel that he's never seen before that has, quote, the 7 deadly enemies of man, which we know as the 7 deadly sins. They changed it a little bit. And he's brought to this wizard. And the wizard is very old and sitting on his throne. And it turns out the wizard's name is Shazam. And because Billy Batson is pure of heart, Shazam is going to grant him his powers. And so, as she said, the acronym is S for Solomon for wisdom, H for Hercules for strength, Atlas for stamina, Z for Zeus, power, A again for Achilles, courage, and M for Mercury for speed. These are all the powers that he's going to get simply by saying Shazam. And lo and behold, so there's Billy and the old wizard. And so he says the wizard's name, and there's this giant, huge block of concrete hanging over Shazam's head by a thread. And when Billy Batson says the word, the thread breaks and it smashes the wizard to smithereens and supposedly kills him. But his sort of ghost spirit then rises, and he's freed up to not have to be this wizard anymore, and to basically become a god, and that Captain Marvel now would resume his mission of fighting evil on Earth. So Billy Batson says Shazam and becomes Fred McMurray. And not really, but the look of Captain Marvel was based on the actor Fred McMurray, which you can see here. And this is a drawing by C.C. Beck. And he, again, they very consciously designed the costume so that it would hopefully not be a copy of Superman. He wears a cape, a sort of a short cape that's pulled to the side, that was inspired by turn of the century opera singers, and then the outfit underneath, the tights, is meant to mimic acrobats, circus performers. Okay, this is me in 1974, and we're jumping ahead here, and then we're going to jump right back. But there was a very interesting, strange history to what happened with the character of Captain Marvel. But this is basically just to show like my geek cred. I was in fourth grade. It's 1974, and I have these wonderful parents, and I have a brother 2 years older, and every year they'd ask us, what do you want to be for Halloween? And we'd decide, and then they'd figure out how to make it. My mother was a wonderful seamstress, and so she made this costume for me from scratch. And also there was a contest at school because Captain Marvel doesn't wear a mask. So I just got this generic mask of a guy because I didn't want people to know who I was. And so there I am in action. And my mom actually put this together just based on the drawings. There wasn't any pattern for it. So Captain Marvel comes out in what's called Whiz Comics. Of course, Superman first started in Action Comics. So, and Whiz Comics was just an instant hit. Kids loved this concept that they could, say a word and become this super powerful guy. So and as the woman who introduced me said, the numbers were huge, and it's kind of hard if you're a comic book fan today, and there's tons of comic books are still published, but a really popular one might sell 20,000 copies a month. Back then, Captain Marvel was selling 1 million copies a month, and the war had just started, and was just about to start. Sorry, and so all of a sudden they had all this demand for more stories, and it was more than the artist C.C. Beck could do. And this is an early panel from one of the stories that they used freelancers to draw. There were a lot in going forward. There was a lot of different artists who drew these characters, but the first people to draw Captain Marvel after C.C. Beck were young kids named Jack Kirby and Joe Simon. So depending on how much you know or care about comic books, they were also moonlighting and working on another character called Captain America, and they had to decide which captain they were going to go with, because it was too much work to do both. And so they only did, I think, 2 issues of Captain Marvel, and then left to create Captain America, which has become, this huge, amazing, wonderful phenomenon. But they were trying to follow C.C. Beck's style, but you can just see with the fluidity of it that's early Kirby. So Captain Marvel debuts. It's a huge hit, and Fawcett just starts to license stuff to make things. Um, so because so that kids could have a physical, tactical thing to go along with the story. And this is just, I'm going to show a bunch of this kind of stuff. And they made tin racing cars, which I always thought was hilarious because Captain Marvel can fly and run really fast, and he would never need a racing car. But they made them anyway, just because kids like tin racing cars. And so, with the success of Captain Marvel, Fawcett branched out, um, and their other really big title was a character called Spy Smasher. Does anybody remember Spy Smasher? And that he was essentially sort of the Batman of the Fawcett comic book family, as in he didn't actually have any superpowers except that he was really rich. So he turned himself into this sort of like aviator inventor guy, uh, with a secret identity, and he became Spy Smasher. But um, once the war started, there was paper shortage. So what Fawcett decided to do what's illustrated here is they made smaller versions of the comics for kids. It's 2 for 5 cents, if that's all they could afford, and the regular price of comic books was a dime, which was a lot at that time. And if you were really lucky and either saved up a lot or your parents did, then you could get a Captain Marvel wristwatch. So, as the stories were becoming more and more popular, they wanted to expand what eventually they called the Marvel family. So, so there became Captain Marvel Jr., which I will show you in a second. But um, just things like a patch that you could send away for. There was lots of novelties that kids wanted to send away for. Captain Marvel would write them, you know, personal letters. Like thanks for being in the Captain Marvel Club. On the right is a paper toy that you put together called the Radar Racer, whatever that is. And I just loved this image. This is a puzzle that you put together, and in one of the stories, now Captain Marvel is fighting World War II, and he takes this Nazi plane and breaks it up in midair, and then fashions a machine gun on the top of the propeller and flies it and turns it into, frankly, this machine to destroy more planes. So um, there's Superman, Batman. They had this ethic where they would not kill another human being, even if they were fighting the war, and that was a major difference with Captain Marvel. I mean, they never showed you directly that he was going to kill an enemy, but clearly that's sort of what's going on here. Okay, so Captain Marvel's the big hit. Now he needs his Robin, actually, which became this uh, poor crippled boy named Freddie Freeman. And Billy Batson meets Freddie Freeman, and again, Freddie's like homeless and begging on the street, and bestows some of Shazam's power to him. And what he does in order to transform is to just say Captain Marvel's name. So he says Captain Marvel and turns into Captain Marvel Jr., which is basically, but he doesn't get any older. He stays the same age, and then helps Captain Marvel with whatever he needs helping with. Now, the artist on Captain Marvel Jr. was this amazing guy named Mac Rayboy, who came from a fine art illustration background. And it was odd because the the drawing styles were very different. Captain Marvel had these really sort of squinty eyes that were just sort of lines, and Captain Marvel Jr. had eyeballs, but they sort of made it all work. But this is an example on the left of a Mac Rayboy panel, um, which is literally very striking. But the use of silhouette, the giant sound effect, these were all part of his aesthetic. And then on the right, I don't know. I think this was for a cover of one of the comics, but you could see this like super realistic depiction of Captain Marvel Jr. to look like he's a real kid. And when Rayboy was on his game, like that's what he was really good at. Which started the concept of, all right, what would these characters actually look like in real life? On the left, a classic. This is a sort of allegorical thing where Billy Batson is clobbering the Nazi, but it's not really him. It's Captain Marvel. So comics at the time would use these sorts of juxtapositions all the time, keeping in mind that a kid would probably respond better to a kid beating up a Nazi rather than the adult. Like they could do it too. On the right is, again, that's Mac Rayboy, but again, look at the difference in the eyes of Captain Marvel, which are just the lines, and Captain Marvel Jr. is very alert and looking right at you, and Hitler's very sad because he's about to be defeated. And more of this on the left. Now, of course, very politically incorrect, but it's the title is Captain Marvel swats the Japs! Exclamation point, which of course was acceptable at that time. And just more of the contrasting art style between C.C. Beck on the left and Rayboy on the right. Again, very realistic. And apparently the lore is they actually, the two artists didn't get along at all. But there was so much demand for the Marvel family of comics that they all just had to like produce. And again, at this point, it's very much outselling Superman and Batman. And there's a good point to that later. Okay, so now let's appeal to girls. So they introduce Mary Marvel, and she is Billy's long lost sister who suddenly sort of shows up, and she's an orphan too, and they still don't know who their parents are. But he bestows some of Shazam's power to Mary. So now Mary Marvel says Shazam and becomes Mary Marvel. And again, this was very smart, very calculated on the part of the creators and the publisher. There was Wonder Woman from DC, but there was no young girl in superhero comics to appeal to young girls, and so they were the first to introduce the concept. In doing the research for this book, I went to several different sources, but there's a guy who's mentioned in the book, but his specialty is collecting old photographs from the 40s and 50s of kids in costume, in homemade costumes of superheroes, and what we now call, of course, cosplay, which is, so this is basically what I was doing, but this is the 40s, and by now, of course, Mary Marvel exists, and this little girl can become her. And this was an ad um, introducing Mary Marvel, and it's the I remember as a kid, like the stories. It's really sort of odd because these big, tough, mean guys are getting set to like beat up this little girl, but she's indestructible. So they try to hit her and do all this stuff, and nothing will hurt her, and then she beats the tar out of them. It's really kind of a great optic. She was a sister to Billy Batson. It's a little complicated. Freddie Freeman wasn't actually related to them in any way. He was just their friend. And and the weird thing with Freddie Freeman was he was like something out of Dickens. I mean, he was this cripple. I don't know what he had, whether it was polio or whatever, but he had a crutch and would sort of hobble around and then say Captain Marvel and turn into this powerful kid. And you'd think, why would you ever turn back? Because with Billy Batson, he was then he became a radio reporter. So he would go back and forth all the time so that he could be Billy Batson, boy radio reporter, and then get in trouble and then say Shazam. Whereas you know, Captain Marvel Jr., it's like, why would you ever not want to be Captain Marvel Jr. and just go back to being a cripple? But then you wouldn't have as good a story. So here's at this point, once the Marvel family is established, here's a portrait of the three of them. And then, of course, comes along the movies. And the story goes that Republic Pictures wanted to make. Do we all know what the Saturday morning serials were back then? It's where the term cliffhanger literally came from. So you'd have these short little movies before the feature. Usually, they started as westerns. So literally, and like 12 chapters with one storyline going through. But at the end of each one, some horrible thing would happen so that you would want to see the next one next week or next month, or when you'd have to. And sometimes somebody would literally be hanging off a cliff. Tune in next week, or not tune in, but come to the movies next week to see what happens. So then comic books started, and they decided, let's try this with superheroes, and these were the very first superhero films. And Republic, I think they went to DC Comics first, and they said, we want to do Superman, and DC just said, comic books are our thing. We're not going to go into film. And so then they went to Fawcett, and they said, absolutely. So Captain Marvel became the first movie superhero. Now, if we're going to want to get really geeky about it, if you consider Zorro a superhero, then no. What's his name? Errol Flynn. But because Zorro wears a mask. But purists sort of see Captain Marvel as the first really super powered being in this kind of costume to get on the screen. And this became a big hit. And then, of course, Superman followed right behind, and Batman and Captain America. So The Adventures of Captain Marvel, a Republic serial in 12 chapters. Hard to read. Okay, the curse of the scorpion. Um, and ironically, they did not cast Fred McMurray. They cast a guy named Tom Tyler, who was he was just sort of a bit player in westerns, and he actually appears in Gone with the Wind for about 3 minutes, but he looked perfect, and the costume was really great. It was completely um, faithful to the one in the comics, and so there he is. And of the various serials, I mean, all of these were made for no money, but the Captain Marvel one really is the best, and he really looks like he did in the comics. And I forget Billy who played Billy Batson. It's in the book. Um, but I remember as a kid, every now and then they'd show bits of these on TV, and I uh, just got so excited about it. So here he is. This is at the end. There's this scorpion machine that if you lift the tail, this death ray comes out and blows everything up. And so now he's going to destroy this and save humanity. And I loved this still too of him lifting up this fallen tree, uh, so that this car can go by. And when I was putting the book together, I realized that I followed up this image, and seriously did not intend to do this on purpose, but this is going back to me, and I must have been subconsciously wanting to do the same thing. And then they just made all of this stuff, and today this is, we're used to this. Back then it was really sort of kind of a blitz. So you had everything from, Captain Marvel and Mary Marvel illustrated soap. And then they started the Captain Marvel Club. On the left, upper left is a hat, and it was becoming all of this stuff was becoming so popular, and kids were sending in their dimes to Fawcett to get this stuff. And with the hat, they sold out, and they kept getting all these hundreds of requests. So that in the meantime, they were making more of these hats, but they sent out a poem from Captain Marvel to the kids apologizing. And he says, "I'm really sorry, little chum, and hope this news won't make you glum. The overseas cap that I had are all sold out, but don't be sad. My iron-ons are in its place. Your clothes and playthings they will grace, and after all is said and done, an iron-on is much more fun." So they sent them iron-on patches instead. But kids got the feeling that Captain Marvel was communicating directly with them, and soon, Superman and Batman would start to talk to the fans too, but they did it first. And then became popular in other countries, other cultures. Del Capitan Marvel. I think that actually this was a Cuban cigarette card album, and some of the art from that again, which I thought was just that really beautiful. They're fleshing out the drawing, so it doesn't look so flat. And see the secret decoder on the left. I became obsessed with secret decoders for a while, and so they would print these coded messages in the comic book, and you had to send away for this thing to figure out what he was saying. uh, and again with the machine gun on the right, and obviously during the war, this was all deemed to be okay. This I thought was especially hilarious. It was a Captain Marvel cape that little kids could send away for, right? But and again, it's 1944, 1945, but somebody had the forthright of mind to print on it. This is a play cape. It does not possess superhuman powers. Um, so that kids wouldn't tie it around their necks and then jump out the window. Um, and why stop at human beings when you can go to a rabbit? So Hoppy the Marvel Bunny was introduced, and that was aimed at a whole other segment of the readership. There was a whole genre at the time of what we call funny animal books, which of course was all started by Mickey Mouse. But so this whole sort of what we call universe was translated into animals, and that was hugely popular too. And they made and then they made dolls. So basically, after the first couple of years, the lawyers at DC Comics who had done Superman got very, very upset because they were Captain Marvel was literally stealing their thunder away from them. And so they started a copyright infringement lawsuit against Fawcett, um, to cease and desist publication of Captain Marvel because it's a ripoff of Superman and it's too similar, and we're going to come and get you. And so what ensued through the 40s into the 50s, it was endless. Um, was this back and forth? Fawcett would countersue them, and in the book at the end, I was actually given some of the transcripts of this, and that I could print in the book, and the testimony is just endless and tedious, and um, basically, finally, um, Fawcett was starting to get worn down, and now we're crossing from the 1940s into the early 1950s. But this was Exhibit A. So this is on the left is the very first appearance of Superman in Action Comics #1, 1938. On the right is the cover of Wiz #1, 1940. And so their argument was, I mean, you can imagine, okay, he's wearing a cape. It's got red and yellow in it. He's picking up a car and smashing it with the bad guys in it. And it went on and on like this. And maybe it wasn't the smartest thing in the world to introduce Captain Marvel this way, but they did. And so by the early 1950s, I mean, comic books were still popular, but not nearly as popular as they were during the war. And so sales were going down. And Fawcett had an entire other publishing operation. You may remember Fawcett paperbacks, and all sorts of like quote real books. And they just decided, you know what, we're done. And by 1953, they ceased publication, and this was literally the cover of the last Marvel Family comic book. And it's you know, I think inside there's some invisible ray or doom ray or something that they get zapped away, and that's sort of the end. And this kid is saying, "Holy moly, what happened to the Marvel family?" That was the other thing, is they introduced "holy moly" into the lexicon. That was his exclamation of choice. So after that, what happened? Well, there's two really weird things that happened in comic book history as the 50s turned into the 60s and the 60s turned into the 70s. DC Comics decided in the late 60s that they were going to buy out the rights to Captain Marvel from Fawcett so that then they could, what we now call, reboot the whole thing and republish it, and now fold it into the DC Comics line of superheroes and entertainment, which they did. But in the meantime, and I'm not going to go too far into this because it's too confusing, but Marvel Comics, then the huge rival to DC, bought the rights to the name Captain Marvel because DC had not swooped in soon enough. So what DC had was Shazam, but now Marvel Comics, who does, Spider-Man, the Avengers, etc., got the rights to the name Captain Marvel. And thus you have the movie that opened this weekend, which is Captain Marvel. And there have been several versions of characters with that name in the Marvel universe, but the most recent one of the last 10 years is a woman, which was very smart. And the whole story is very interesting. She was a fighter pilot and aliens and what have you. And it's pretty good. I mean, it has nothing to do with the concept of the character for DC, but what DC then proceeded with was Shazam. Like, they're going to call him Shazam now. And that's sort of where it is. But I think what DC has really struggled with is to try and make this character relevant again, because it really was of its time in the 40s. As you saw, it was it became a lot about the war effort, and somehow with a concept like Batman, it manages to adapt to the times. So, Batman could be like goofy and fun in the 60s because Vietnam was happening and people needed comic relief. And then it became dark again in the 70s and 80s because people were ready for that. And now, of course, it's really dark. But it manages to stay popular. Whereas with Shazam, they haven't been able to really figure out how to make it connect with the public the way it used to. But what they're doing to confuse things even further is releasing a Shazam movie in about a month. So I'm just going to show you what they're doing with that. And then I'll do some Q&A and sign. So this is, and you, if you're interested, you might have seen this already, but this is the final trailer for the Shazam movie. The basic concept is the same. You have Billy Batson, who's an orphan, down in his luck, being shuttled to foster homes, and then you'll see the subway and the wizard, and then he becomes, and the design of the costume isn't that different, although he has a hoodie now, which drives me crazy. But the main difference is that, as with the movie Big, they can't call him Captain Marvel. Shazam, the adult, seems to have the mind of the kid, and that is what their basic hook is going to be. And to me, it looks like it could go either way. I mean, trailer's a trailer. I mean, it's fun and the best parts of the movie usually. And we'll see if the movie's any good. But it's kind of interesting to see the contrast.
You've run from foster homes in 6 counties.
I can take care of myself.
When you're 18, give these people a chance, because that's what they're giving you.
This is Billy Batson. Make sure you make him feel at home.
They seem nice, but don't buy it. It gets real Game of Thrones around here. Dude, just messing around. You look at me and you're like, why so dark? You're a disabled foster kid. You've got it all. If you could have one superpower, what would you pick? Everybody chooses flight. You know why?
So they can fly away from this conversation?
No, because heroes fly.
Well, you need your fake family to stand up for you? Hey! Man, sorry about that. Go, go, go! Grab it! Get out the way!
Billy Batson. I choose you as champion.
Hello?
Say my name so my powers may flow through you.
But I don't know your name, sir.
Shazam.
Are you for real? Say, okay! Shazam?
This means Billy!
What is happening?
You're the only person I know that knows anything about this Cape Crusader stuff.
Can I...
Oh, yeah.
That's crazy, right?
What are your superpowers?
Superpowers, dude? I don't even know how to pee in this thing.
AM to the PM, PM to the AM.
You have super strength! Can you fly?
If I quit your PM, I still rap with Zeus. If I quit this season, I still be the greatest.
You okay? Why are you talking?
Be humble. Sit down.
You know, I don't think that's gonna buff out.
Your phone's charged. Your phone's charged.
What the hell?
You're like a bad guy, right?
Gentlemen!
You have bullet immunity!
I'm bulletproof.
You're dead.
Sorry about your window,
Have a
but
good night.
you're welcome for not getting robbed. Oh, hey, what's up? I'm a superhero.
So they're trying to make the superhero movie a little lighter, and we'll see if people show up. I mean, I'll go because I have to. So if anybody has any questions or concerns.
I have a question. Thank you for your presentation. Was this character marketed internationally in foreign languages? Question one. Question two is, were there in other cultures and countries, was this phenomenon of creating superheroes and comics, were there competitors internationally? That's a really good question. And first of all, the question was about foreign publication, and there was some. I showed a little bit of the Spanish, and I don't get the impression that well, to further complicate things, the British came up with a character named Marvel Man, which was very, very much based on the Captain Marvel family, and that was for the UK only. But I don't get the sense that Captain Marvel Shazam was much of a global phenomenon. One of the other books I did is called Batmanga: The Secret History of Batman in Japan, and again, like Batman and Superman actually is international phenomenon. I do think were much more popular. And then and the Japanese went so far as to license their own stories. But in terms of original like superheroes from other countries, there really isn't that much. It seems to be a pretty, frankly, American concept. But then you have things in Europe like Asterix, which is huge. I mean, huge in Europe, that makes nary a ripple here. So it's with cartoons and comics, sometimes specific cultures create what works for them. Sure.
Switch sides.
Oh, sorry.
You said that he was more popular than Superman. The movie serials don't work today, the old ones.
Right.
But in the early 1940s, Fleischer Studios did the animated Supermans.
Yes.
If this was more popular than Superman, did anybody try an animated version of Captain Marvel and how to do?
That's a very good question. And when I say Captain Marvel was more popular than Superman, that's in terms of sales, which I guess is the only way you measure anything. But yeah, that's a really good point about the Fleischer Superman cartoons, which, I mean, that's a whole other subject. I could stand up here and talk for 20 minutes on those. Those are the best animation ever created. To my knowledge, no one in the 40s tried to animate Captain Marvel or the Marvel family. Now that you mention it, I think there was an animated show that DC tried in like the 70s. I mean, and then there was the whole other Shazam show, Saturday morning show, which is what woke me up to it. But no. No. And I always wondered about like what would have happened if the Fleischers would have tried to do Batman. It would have just been incredible. But that whole Fleischer story is so interesting, which you may or may not know, which basically Paramount wanted to compete with Disney. The Fleischers were at the top of their game. Paramount went to them and said, we want you to do a Superman cartoon. And they really didn't want to do it. So their way of saying no was, well, okay, but it will cost you $100,000 an episode. And they said, fine. And then they were committed to do it. And it's just amazing. If anybody who hasn't seen them, it's beautiful filmmaking. They were obviously very, very influenced by Orson Welles.
Thanks, Chip. That was an interesting background. A comment and a question. And the comment is, when I was 8 or 9 years old, I lived in Coral Gables, Florida, and every Saturday I'd take my quarter allowance and go to the local movie theater. And as we paid our 14-cent admission, we'd get something like a box of marbles. And they'd sit down, and there'd be a stage show with like a live musician, a newsreel, a coming attractions, which is the only thing left these days, a short by like Walt Disney, which might be 20 minutes, and did I say news to the world? And the feature, whatever that was. Oh, wait a minute, a serial, which one time was, one Saturday it ended, you see a guy on a motorcycle racing down a tunnel, and behind him the tunnel is completely filled with a wall of water. And then you had come back next Saturday to find out what happened to him. And then the feature show. And it sort of discourages me from going to movies these days. But anyway, my question is, who was the artist for Mary Marvel?
Who was the what?
Artist for Mary Marvel.
Oh, wow. You'd think I would know. Well, it was C.C. Beck initially. But I'd literally have to like look it up in the book.
It sort of looks like Beck's style.
Yes. And but the curious question would be, did a female artist ever work on her? And to my knowledge, not. Jack Binder. Okay. God bless our smartphones.
could you describe the relationship between Captain Marvel Jr. and Elvis Presley?
Oh, yes. Thank you. I completely forgot this. Elvis Presley, I mean, I don't know if you want to say obsessed, I don't know, but very much was a fan of the Marvel comics. And if you look at the outfits that he was wearing towards the end of his career, that was the basis for those. So the cape, and yes, that wasn't just Las Vegas. It was Las Vegas meets the Marvel family. But yes, thank you for bringing that up. He and I think he very much acknowledged that.
Hi. So you mentioned earlier how like the more lighthearted Batman and other superhero films of the '60s was kind of comic relief for the Vietnam War era America. So I'm wondering what elements of today's America do you think have created the demand for more lighthearted superhero fare like Shazam, Deadpool, films of that nature? I especially wonder because you'd think perhaps in the wake of the success of the Dark Knight franchise that we'd be seeing more, darker, serious superhero movies, given that that trilogy's template, but that hasn't entirely been the case.
Right. That's a very, very good question. In my opinion, at this point, the phenomenon of the superhero film itself is so prevalent and frankly so successful. I mean, they would not keep making these things if they were losing money. That I think they're trying lots of different things. But I remember when I heard, and this is geeky and probably too much for most of the audience, but when I heard that they were doing a Deadpool movie, I was shocked because I just thought, how is that going to work? And they showed you, but wow, but that was also the first R-rated superhero movies, and that's a whole other frontier, if you want to call it that. But I think they're working on the rebooting Batman, and I'm sure that that's going to continue to be very dark. The Joker movie is coming out this fall with Joaquin Phoenix, who is the sort of actor who would never take that on if it was going to be silly or not seen as quote, like, serious filmmaking, serious cinema. So and then you have Guardians of the Galaxy, which was so, and again, it's like, who, what, but it was so well done, and it was so endearing and sweet and funny that it then becomes a huge success. So success bears copying, and like, okay, lighthearted worked for them, let's see if it's gonna work for us. I mean, it would, I don't know, I think it would be in the book, in my little introduction, I said Superman's thing was strength. His main superpower was like strength. Batman's superpower was fear, creating fear in his enemies before he even lays a finger on them. Captain Marvel's appeal, his superpower, frankly, was charm. Mm-hmm. And a lot of the stories, despite the machine gun stuff, are very sort of funny and lighthearted. A lion is about to chomp off Billy Batson's head, and just as the jaws are closing, he says Shazam and turns into Captain Marvel, and the teeth break off, and ha ha ha, it's fun. So I don't think there's anything wrong with that. I just want to I want to see a good movie. But the book I did for who I steadfastly call Captain Marvel, even though he's legally known as Shazam now, does sort of stick to literally quote the golden age, when which in his particular case was 1940 to 1953, and it's not a history of the character beyond that, and I'm completely meandering.
Okay.
So I'm going to selfishly take what unfortunately has to be our last question. Bringing it back into the book, it is large and very colorful and extraordinary. How did you decide what went into the book and what had to get cut?
And that too was a very good question. How did I decide what would go into the book and what would get cut? Frankly, there was it, and I'm a big toy collector of a certain kind of genre and a time period. And so in that world, in that collecting world, which is relatively small, I knew that there was this gentleman named Harry Matetsky, who is still with us, but he's of an age, and he was working at Fawcett in the last days of all the Captain Marvel stuff, and they were throwing away their file copies of everything, and he was a fan and he loved it, so he would pick them out of the garbage and take them home. And so he had the collection of Captain Marvel stuff, which I knew, and he lived in, I don't know, West Orange, New Jersey, which I also knew was, just a train ride away from Manhattan. But again, to put a project like that together, you have to get DC Comics on board with it, and which obviously they were, because it's preserving their history. But what's so weird is, like, it's not really their history, it's Fawcett's history, but they bought that, so now it's their history too. I can't think of anything that we had to cut. And what I also wanted to really try and do, and I didn't really show, is to show I'm fascinated with the comic book production process and how a drawing on a page then becomes a comic book page with coloring and lettering and all of that. And so I showed a couple examples of here's what the original drawing looked like, and here's how it looked when you were a kid, and seeing the printing process, because so much of that art from the 40s and 50s was just thrown away. It was considered, production art, and so if some people kept some, but again, like hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of pages of that stuff were being generated every month, and also the modus operandi was to not return the artwork to the artist, and that's a whole other subject. So it would get thrown away, it would be used as packing material, and again, I'm meandering, but no, the DC was really great. But the only, like, you'll see if you look at the book, the cover says Shazam, the golden age of the world's mightiest mortal, because that was one of his taglines, as opposed to the Man of Steel. But if you look at the title page, it says the golden age of Captain Marvel, which they let me do. And again, I don't even know if they would allow that now, because now Marvel is with this weekend in this film, which is very good and is doing very well. Marvel owns that now. I mean, really owns it. And they own it in the hearts and minds of the fans, that Captain Marvel is a Marvel character and Shazam is the DC one. So, but yeah, I was really pleased. DC could have said, well, but you have to include, the comics then when we started it up again in the 70s and 80s and all that stuff. And they didn't. They said, that's fine. It's the golden age. We can keep it the golden age.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much.
Thank you.